I'm gonna have to do a lean in. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Eunice, and this is Metalsmith Shop. And what we're gonna do is just take a look at how I do my sheet metal art. I was trained as a tinsmith, but I work in a number of different metals, including brass and copper. And today we're just going to kind of go over some of the basics of what it takes to do this kind of artwork and look at some of the tools involved and things like that. So I hope you enjoy it. I do have chat going on in the background, although it's hard to kind of check while I'm creating art. So bear with me if I miss any of your comments, but I appreciate everyone who could make it here today, and thanks. So let's see. Okay. So let's start with a little bit of the basics. First thing is essentially what we're going to be doing is using custom punches to stamp on the metal. We've got some padding that allows the punches to shape the metal. This workstation here, you can see this is just a heavy piece of steel. Below it is the actual leg of the table, and it's very important. You have to have a direct support right from where you're working and hammering straight down to the ground. It's very important to have that to get a nice quality image in your tin work. So next step is something for the metal to form into. I grew up using newspaper, but you'll get many answers depending on how many tinsmiths you ask. People in the past have used everything from sections of phone book to leather and even magazines. But what's really interesting is even though you're using a lot of force with the metal and the hammers, you can really feel the difference in the material that you use, and it can give it quite a bit of a different look to it depending on what material you use. So my suggestion to anyone who's interested in doing this kind of artwork is, try a number of different materials. And obviously, if you have something that's in your life already, for example, you have a daily subscription to a newspaper, or there's a regular weekly tabloid or something like that you get, try that. I mean, it's laying around already anyway. One of the things you can do also to play with kind of the quality of stamp you're getting is just play with the thickness of it. If you've got Italian Vogue and it's tightly bound with a bunch of ads or something like that, then you might want to strip it down to, say, 10, 15 sheets of that, to try to play with the effect that it has on the stamp work. So that consists of the workstation there. The hammer that tinsmiths generally like to use is this style. You see with this rounded end here, flat end on this side, and this is referred to as a ball peen hammer. This one I specifically use for the actual stamp work. Hammers come by weight, and this particular one is 16 ounce. But again, that's by feel, so you can kind of play with that and see what's comfortable for you. I've also got this larger one. A lot of people think it's just something that I keep for people who have too many questions. But actually, it's large, not for the weight of it, but for this nice flat face here. You'll see that as we work the metal, we're going to be shaping that metal. And we want to take some of that shaping out and allow the stamp work to stand proud. And having that nice flat surface allows us to do that. It's important that you don't mix these up. You don't want to be stamping with your nice flat hammer because it will mar this surface, and then those surface mars will be transferred to your artwork. So you want to be careful about that. So the next thing, and one of the things that makes this style of metalwork very unique, is your custom punches. So this is an example of some of the different punches that I use. And you'll see that there's little teeth cut into here. And those teeth are going to create patterns. As you can see, I've got a number of different shapes here. So what I can do is, instead of actually laying this out and stamping the dots one at a time, I can use these shaped punches to actually build larger shapes and create designs on the fly, which is something I'll be demonstrating in just a moment. These tools are a wonderful treasure for me. I was blessed in that my family's been doing this for many years, since the turn of the century. And I'm the fifth generation in my family to continue this tradition. And so one of the benefits of that is that they left punches to me. I'm the only one in my generation that continued to do this work. So all of the previous tinsmiths have led their tools to me, which gives me quite a big collection of custom punches. But the reality is, with a well-chosen set, you really only need about 7 well-chosen punches to cover pretty much everything you would need to make some very intricate and high-quality designs in your own work. I want to show you an example of a couple of fun pieces here. So this guy right here was my great grandfather's, Francisco Delgado. And it's just wonderfully hand worked. You can see just the hand hammering and everything. This is the work of a blacksmith, which is what was funny. It reminds you of a time when nobody did it all. You had to really have relationships with people. You know, there was trading, there was bartering to craft these very unique tools. And who would have thought, you know, I don't know what he traded for or paid for these tools, but I wonder if he ever imagined that his great-great-grandson would one day be using those very same tools to continue his artwork and traditions. This one's fun. So this one, if you look at it, it's got these little diagonal lines on it. And so these belonged to my great-grandfather, Ildeberto Delgado. And so this is something that he did to mark his tools because they were very precious. They were handed down within family. He didn't want to lose them. And as it turned out, there's a great story behind these because he lent them out at some point for someone else to learn how to do tin work. And the tools did not get back to the family for quite a long time. But we'll save that story for another time. It's a good one. So this one will be interesting from a historical point of view. See if anybody recognizes that. Okay? It's a little bit intimidating when you first see it. It's not what you think. Of course, when the Germans decided to use that as their moniker during World War II, it kind of reset what that image meant. And it's actually referred to as whirling logs by the Native Americans, and goes back as far as East Indian, Hindu, for over 1,000 years. And it would actually meant harmony and balance. You know, consider the irony in that. So anyway, you know, my family has both a Spanish heritage and a Native heritage. And so it was really appropriate that we have such a classic Native image as part of our tool set. But even knowing all that, there are times when I have included that design in a custom piece and delivered it, and the customer has turned it down, which of course, you know, I don't blame them. I don't expect them to have to explain and educate everyone that they meet or run into about it. But it's just interesting to see how these symbols can be used or misused throughout history. So as you can see by my workstation here, I keep the tools all kind of packed into this area here on end so I can see the various designs available to me. I also use dividers. These are basically like a compass you would have used in school, only it's sharp on both sides because one point grabs the metal and the other point scores a very fine line that we can use for a variety of different designs. Steel wool is generally what we use. Steel wool comes in different grades. You can find it kind of in the paint shop area. And I use quadruple aught, 4-aught, or very, very fine steel wool. And this just does a nice job of cleaning off any marks or mars on your sheet metal and giving you a nice regular finish. And then I like using just these very fine Sharpies. Whatever you mark up your tin with as far as laying out designs or even notes to yourself can be removed either by the steel wool at the end of the process or acetone, which is the same stuff that's in nail polish remover, does a great job of removing this stuff. So it's nowhere near permanent. It's not a hassle at all. In fact, if you take a little cotton swab and dip it into it, it just wipes it right off like it was a dry erase marker. So these are handy for being able to put in little notes and guidelines in your work. All right, so today I'm going to have to watch the time because I'm a working artist and I'm also a father, but I'm hoping to share with you the creation of a small ornament so you can kind of see how these bits are going to come together. Possibly a small mirror and maybe even a candlestick today because I'd like you to see a little bit of the solder work. Solder work is what we use to join this kind of light gauge sheet metal together. So I'd like you to be able to see that. One final piece I do want to share with you. So this is how we actually cut our designs, right? So sooner or later you're creating art, you're going to lay out designs and you need to cut those out. These snips are referred to as either aviation snips or tin snips. This particular kind is a brand called Weiss, which I really, really stand by. There are places where you can cut corners on your tools and get, you know, generic brand tools and things like this. Your snips are not one of those places. You should be paying somewhere between $16 and $22 for your snips and doing so happily because you definitely want quality here. If you get a cheap pair of snips, the tough thing about it as a new artist is you won't know what part of it is the cheap snips and what part of it is technique that you need to work on. So by getting a good pair of snips, now all you're doing is working on your skill and not having to worry about, you know, how good does this tool actually work for this particular application. When you see tin snips or aviation snips, a lot of times you'll see them with 3 different colored handles. These ones are obviously the yellow ones. You can also see them in red and green, and a lot of times, especially when you're interested in a new artwork, you want to jump into it, you kind of want to get ahead of the game, and so it's tempting to jump in and get, you know, for, in that case, all 3 snips. I'll let you know, though, for the kind of work we're going to be doing, the yellow-handled pair does plenty good for everything you're going to run into. The red handle and the green handles were specifically made to be able to cut a sheet of tin in a curve to either the right or the left from the top of the sheet. Remember, they were aviation snips. And so when you were building aircraft, you needed to be able to stand on top of a large sheet of aluminum and still be able to cut curves. And that's what specifically those red and green pair that you'll see are meant for. The yellow pair is just fine for everything we're going to be doing. So here's an example of some of the tin sheet. Tin sheet comes in a variety of applications, and the original sheet was actually tin itself. Tin is an element on the periodic table, but it's a very, very soft metal, and so in modern times when you see it listed as a tin product, it's actually a sandwich. If you could cut it in half and look at it very closely on a microscopic level, what would you would actually find a sandwich of a variety of metals to both strengthen the tin and also increase the weather resistance of the metal. The original artists that worked in New Mexico were actually silversmiths that were recycling tin that the U.S. Army garrisons brought their supplies in. But the closest modern equivalent that we find to that material is roofing tin that I have to get from out east. Okay, so you want it to be fairly light gauge, and if you're familiar with gauge, I work in somewhere between 32 and 28 gauge. Gauge is one of those numbers, one of those units of measurement that is a little backwards from what you might expect. So as the number of gauge goes down, the thickness of the material you're working on goes up. So it's something to keep in mind when you're talking to other artists and trying to figure out what your comfort level is. If you're just interested in getting into this and trying some of it, there are some tin products at the big box stores, the big hardware stores. You're going to go into the roofing department and you're going to look for galvanized tin. Now that tin doesn't necessarily have the best finish, but it works and it solders, and it's a great place to start as far as getting some quick material to be able to try some of this stuff out on. Okay. So what we're going to do is start with a piece of tin here. I've got my sheet and I've got a little pattern that I've pre-made, and we're going to make an ornament. So I'm just going to lay that pattern in on the sheet. I'm going to take my Sharpie and just trace right around this guy here. I've got a little hole for right on center, which makes a good reference point for any design we might want to do later. And I end up right here. So unfortunately, I can't see what I'm filming in real time, so I apologize a few of these times when I lift these things up to show you. There may be glare. I'll try to rotate it some to see if I can get away from that, but I apologize. I can't always see whether you've got glare or not in the image. So I've got this right here laid out. I'm going to take my handy dandy tin snips or aviation snips, and I'm going to cut this out. Now generally when we go to cut tin, although these look like scissors that you would use for paper or fabric, they're not. They're very heavy duty. They've got a similar action, but they're very they're articulated, and they work a bit differently. For one thing, you can't just go right in and start cutting the tin around the shape that you intend to use. The reason is the tin has a weight to it. It actually fights the tool working through the tin. So if you think about fabric or paper, it's going to move out of the way for you, okay? But with tin, it's really going to fight you the whole way. So what you want to do is work in steps to kind of walk down to that final trim cut, okay? The way I'm going to do that in this case, I'm just going to imagine a box around my shape, and I'm just going to cut this larger piece right out from here. Now, with the snips, you'll notice it's got these little horns here. The reason why is to use them properly, you want to maintain forward pressure into your cut as you open the jaws so that you stay right in that cut. If you use it like scissors and just kind of chop away at it, you're going to end up with a lot of what we call burrs, which are just basically really sharp metal points, okay? So I'll give you an example of that. I'm just going to cut away here. Okay, and you can see right here these little guys coming up, and of course this is exaggerated because I wanted you to be able to see what it looks like. But those little sharp points, they will definitely get you. So you really want to avoid that. Now, as you're learning this technique, you may end up with burrs. It's just a natural part of the process. The way you handle that is you put the tool on edge and you just run it along the edge. And what it'll do is it'll stop on that burr, even if it's a small one. Once you stop there, you can just rotate and cut a fresh line. The nice thing about this kind of metal work is it's fairly low pressure, so you know, cutting a little bit of a fresh line inside of your first line is probably not going to affect your end piece that much. So once I do that initial cut to get that larger chunk out of the way, now I'm going to do a second pass, and I'm just going to remove these corners, okay? So squeeze down, and then as it comes open, I'm pushing up into that cut, okay? So squeeze down and push into that cut as it opens. Stay into that cut, okay? And we end up here. So I've got about an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch strip going all the way around my design there. So what we're going to do now is the final cut. I'm going to go in, and the way you cut a nice clean curve is as I cut, this hand is going to focus on maintaining that forward pressure, and this hand is going to guide the tin, okay? So this is going to cut, and then I'm just rolling that tin into that cut to make that curve. And you'll see now, instead of fighting a big sheet of tin over here, this thing is just curling away for me. There we go. You always want to have some kind of a container nearby, kind of a sharps container, so that these little bits can go right into them and protect your workstation. You never know when you're going to have a customer or kids come through and they want to just, you know, play around, get interested, and those little tiny burrs can catch them by surprise. The easiest way to do that is as soon as you've got some sharps in your workstation, get them into a container somewhere. All right, so now we've got a nice little round piece of sheet metal here, and we're going to decorate it. Now, traditionally in northern New Mexico, there was only about 5 families that did this work, and a lot of the work was for the missions, the Spanish missions, and so it was considered inappropriate to sign your work. And so what they would do is they would actually each family had their own particular design for what they call the edging, or just the edge of the piece. For my family, my great-great-grandfather, Francisco Delgado, had a fairly simple design that he used for what he called his everyday tin. And then he reserved a very special design called a scallop design that he kept for special gifts like, you know, wedding gifts within the family or something like that. But he felt like it was too busy for everyday tin. But when my grandmother was finally allowed to do tin work, she loved that edging so much that she began to use it all the time for all of her work. And because I was apprenticed to her, I've continued her tradition. So I use that scallop design for my edging. Now, when I say these things, it doesn't mean that there's any kind of copyright or that I would be disappointed if I found somebody else's tin with that. It's just a reference point for the historic connection to how that design is used. Traditionally, we would do the edging from the back side of the piece. Now, one of the things that separates this style of tin work that was done in New Mexico from Eastern colonial tin is that Eastern colonial tin tended to be holes pierced through the metal, and then the light shining through those holes created the design. A good example of that would be something like a lantern, or if you think of a pie safe. A lot of times you'll see old pie safes and they'll have a little design of like a wheat or a rooster or something like that. And if you can think of it, it was actually just pierced through holes through that tin. But the artists that were originally doing this work in northern New Mexico were silversmiths first. And so they really looked at metal as something to emboss on, something to shape and form, working from both sides of the piece. And so generally, because the punches are sharpest from the front, generally the main part of your design would be from the front of the piece, and the embellishments would be from the back. So I'm going to begin on the back with our little ornament here and put that edging on. This is the punch I'll be using. You can see this was one of my great-grandfather's punches, and it's a half round without teeth, so it's a smooth half round. Now when you go to stamp, you want to focus on keeping your punch straight up and down through 360 degrees. So you want to be really careful about having the punch straight onto you but leading away from you. You would think that the force of the hammer blow would actually flatten the punch out, and it doesn't. It actually carries it straight down at the angle that you had it held at. And this becomes critical later when you're doing the larger toothed punches, because basically you'll only get part of your design in. If that occurs, you can go back, lock the punch back in step, and then intentionally fill in whatever part of the punch you missed. But of course, it's just better to get in a good habit of getting a nice, smooth, even punch so that you can do a single hit. The other thing is you want to shoot for learning what pressure is required to just do one good solid hit. Okay, you don't want to be doing this kind of thing, trying to make your design going out, because no matter how hard you work to try to keep that punch steady, it will move around and you'll get what's called a ghosted image. It'll look like it's just not very clear. So you want to shoot for that, just one good, nice, solid hit. Okay, so this is what it looked like from the back. Okay, this is the direction I worked in. You can see there's a little bit of curvature here where it got kicked up, and then this is the look we're going for on the front. So that's that scallop design that I was talking about. That's kind of a Delgado family tradition. So now we're going to go ahead and put in what I call a rosette design, or scallops, from the front. I'm going to use my dividers and set them to a distance that I think would be appropriate for my design, and score a light line. That line is probably difficult for you to see because it is just scored in, and in this light it's going to be really difficult. So although I wouldn't actually normally do this in practice, I'm going to go ahead and use a pen to ink it in, because I want you to see how that line guides the design and the other tools, okay? So this is not necessarily a step you would have to take, but I do want you to be able to visualize how this works. Okay, so that represents that scored line that I put in. I'm going to use a half round punch with teeth, okay? And what I'm going to do is that black line that I just scored in, I'm going to set this half round around the circumference of that line, okay? So we're going to place it right down here. Now, I'm actually striking with a bit more force now because the punch is physically larger. I'm pushing down more metal at one time. So I need to actually add a little bit more force here. I'm going to work my way around, and remember, I didn't measure anything. I just placed these in. So there's no promise that anything's going to align. So I work around, and then I'm going to actually stop and just kind of see if I'm in the ballpark here. In this case, we may have a little bit of a sticky wicket here. So I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to mark where that punch is lining up here. And what we're going to find is we're short, okay? We've got some error here. So the way we're going to handle this is we're going to actually compress these to allow a little more room for that final punch to lay in here. There's two things we can do. One is, you'll see on the earlier punches I was actually locking them in step, and I can either slightly move them over or push them a bit out, okay? The second thing is, if I go inside radius, I'm shortening the distance to this point. If I go outside the radius just slightly, I'm increasing the distance. And the reality is I use both techniques. I'm going to use a little bit of displacement on the punches, and I'm going to use a little bit of moving out in my radius to increase that distance. So, hi, Mr. Martinez. Welcome, and welcome from Clovis. Big Air Force base out there. Okay, so let's see if we can get this to line up here. Okay, so there we go. We actually did a pretty good job. It may be easier to see it from the backside. I don't know. Again, I'm trying to hope you can see past some of this glare. But you can see here where the error was on these marks, and you can see where we pushed this design over to allow for that last stamp to fit in as a full design. So when you go, especially with those larger stamps, when you go to strike them, you see you're going to shape the metal. What you want to do is take that shaping out after each pass, okay? You don't want it to build up and curl and curl and curl and then try to take a bunch of shaping out at the same time, because you're risking having the metal wrinkle instead of smoothly flattening back out to the shape you want, okay? And by flattening, I mean just taking some of this extra shaping out. You obviously don't want to push out your stamp marks. But while we're there, I will say that even if I completely flatten this out, because I've actually marred the surface with the tool, you can never completely remove the markings you've made. So some people kind of feel pressured by that, because it's essentially there's no erasing. I tell my students, there's no erasing in tin work, there's only incorporation. So, and you know, if you have small errors in your work, well, that's just character. It's part of your artwork, and some people have a lot more character in their artwork than others. Jimmy, great question on the solders. Obviously, I haven't gotten to demonstrating the solders yet, but it's an important question. So the original solder was tin and lead, and Jimmy in the chat is asking about what sort of solders I use. Because I'm using kind of the older style tin, the original style solder, which is called 50/50 solid core, is the best solder for my choice. I have tried the other solders, including the more modern solders. When you go to look for solders, they're sold in always sold in a percentage of 100, because what you're actually looking at is the percentage of the mix or alloy of metals that make up that solder. And some of the modern solders will have numbers like 95.5, and they'll be like tin and antimony, or you know, 70/30 or something like that. But the original solder was essentially half and half, tin and lead, and it was solid core, and that's what I used, Jimmy. Okay, so I've taken that shaping out of this piece, and now what I'm going to do is take a straight punch and kind of lay in some sides of these scallops here. So I'm just going to take a punch and see how it fits on here. I like this one. Notice as I work around this piece that I'm not trying to just go through and do one right after the other, because I am lining this up by eye, and it makes it a lot easier on your eye if you skip every other one, so you can get a nice true line to center, and then go back and fill in on the split, because it's very easy for your eye to see a split. Okay, so there's that step. We've put that straight line in. Again, we're working from the front now. You can see that we're starting to get some of that curving again in the material. So I'll take my large ball peen and just lightly tap. When you go to do this tapping, you want to be careful to really just tap down on your stamp work, and also do not tilt your punch. Even though this is soft here, or your ball peen hammer, even though it's soft and smooth, if you get into this at an angle, you will leave a little mar or a little dent there that will show. So you want to be easy with that. All right, now I just want to put like a fun little star in the middle. This is what we call a rosette punch. And so you can see it's just kind of a little star flower shape there, and we're going to put that right on center. Now I'm using a nail set. Nail sets are really handy for the beginning tinsmith because you can get them in any hardware store. They're used by Finnish woodworkers to put in the small finish nails without damaging the wood. So the round circle kind of sits over that hole or the head of the nail and allows you to get it right into the wood very clean. But for us, what it means is for a relatively inexpensive price, you're getting a series of circles in different sizes that make a great addition to adorn your tin. And the tin is soft enough that they will stand up to that kind of work and wear. So in this case, I've got that little rosette here, and I've just punched it out from the backside with that nail set. Now I'm going to take the same tool that I used for the main part of my design, and I'm going to work from the inside, from the back side of the piece, right on center. And this is that part I was talking about that kind of differentiates this style of tinwork from others. We're now working from the back side of the piece to raise those scallops out and really get some definition. You'll see how this is going to really catch the light now. There's the back side of the piece. But you can see how by raising that up from the back, we're really catching the light there. I'm going to use that same nail set and just do a final pass on the outside here. And there we go. There's a finished ornament ready for the tree. So I'll let you see what the steel wool's going to do to remove some of these marks and stuff. And give it a nice uniform finish there. So I'm hoping by angling this, I'm getting some of that glare down so you guys can enjoy some of the detail. So in order to turn this into an ornament at this point, the only thing we'd need to do is just take another small nail set. And you'll notice I doubled over the padding here because I don't want to strike my steel plate. I just want to go through the tin. And you can see it doesn't take a lot of pressure to cut right through there. Okay, then we take a little tree ornament here. I like to give them a nice finishing clean twist on the end just so they don't have any sharp bits hanging out. And there we go. Got yourself a little Christmas tree ornament there. Okay, so let's take a look and see how we use our snips. So what I'm going to do next is just kind of show you what it would look like to do something like a small mirror, okay? So what I've got is another piece of turn plate here, another piece of tin, and then I've got a pattern here, in this case kind of a heart-shaped pattern. I'm going to lay this onto my tin. Now, obviously, because you're paying for your tin, it has value, you want to not waste it. So, for example, you don't want to just put it right in the middle of your piece and cut away at it. But you don't necessarily want to push it right up to the edge. It's very difficult for tin snips to make those very thin cuts right along the edge. So you do want to manage the use of your material, but you don't want to get carried away with that. So generally, you're talking about leaving about 1/8 of an inch at least on your edges. I'm going to take that same Sharpie and just trace this out here. And again, work through my steps to Journeyman. I agree. I love the steel wool for cleaning up glass and stuff. So cut that larger piece out, and now I'm just going to cut these little corner bits away here. Okay, and now that I've got just this little piece left, I'm going to start cutting out the detail. Now, as we get to these sharp corners here, what we're going to do is stop and then start again in this direction here and kind of skip, and we'll come back from the other direction to get those inside corners. This small decorative mirror is called a corazon, which means heart in Spanish, and it was my grandmother Angelina's design, so it's always fun to do this design and keep it alive for her. In order to get a nice clean corner, the best technique is to not think of actually cutting that corner out. The best technique is to cut into it. You can see we're coming in from the other direction, and stop right when you see the metal start to pivot. You see that? The little move right there? And what that indicates is you're really close, but you're not quite there. And you finish by just twisting that piece out, and that gives you a nice clean corner. If you try to cut into those corners, invariably you're going to cut through and you're going to leave a little bit of a burr there. So it just gives you a nice clean finish this way. Okay, so there's the outside of the design, which brings up an interesting question. How do we cut from the inside of the design? Because we want a hole in the middle of this where we're going to have a mirror from the back side, okay? So what we're going to do is use a hole punch, which is just simply a very sharp circular punch. I'm going to double over my padding again so I don't go through to the metal plate below. And let's get rid of some of our sharp bits here. We're just going to give it a good hit. Okay, and that cuts a nice little hole. That's where we're going to start our cut from. You're going to work from the bottom of the piece, so you're going to come up through below and work here. The reason is, generally you lay out your artwork from the front of the piece, okay? And the snips, because they're pushing the metal around, especially in these tight inside cuts, they're going to leave scratches and mars. Now, most of those probably would clean up just fine with the steel wool, but to protect yourself from any accidents, you work from below the piece. That way, all the pushing around is occurring on the back side of your mirror. You can see that I did a series of straight cuts and fanned them out. That kind of opens up the space to give me some room to work. On these inside cuts, it's going to be really critical. You're just going to want to use the tip of your snips. And you can also curve your metal, because what it's doing is it's trying to get over this ridge of the snips. So I can curve the metal to make it easier to get these tight turns in. When I'm first cutting, I'm really just looking again to move the larger piece of the metal out of there and leave just a little trim line that we're going to finish here. And that'll give you an idea of some of the stuff it'll do to the backside there. So That's why it's nice that it's on the back and out of view. Now I'm really going to take my time, very careful with using just the very tips of my snips, and just work my way around. Very critical at this point that you're using that technique to push into the cut and stay into it. If you haven't got it down, this is where it's really going to show. You're going to end up with a lot of burrs on these inside curves like this. Now, aviation snips or tin snips actually have serrated teeth. Now, normally when we think of serrations, we think of like a steak knife, something that makes it sharper. But in this case, what it is shaped teeth that actually, if you could look at this cut edge on end closely, it would actually have kind of a wavy look to it. So it's spreading out that edge and making it softer to handle, okay? So it's by using a nice high quality snips, you're also getting a safer end product. Okay, so again, we've got a little bit of shaping here, so we're going to have to take that out. We use a large ball peen from the back side and just tap that out. Go back down to a single piece, and we're going to do our edging again on this piece. So again, with the edging, I'm going to work from the back side of the piece. Remember to take your time. You can't go back and erase, so you don't want to get in a rush. So when my grandmother originally wanted to do tin work, there's some indication of how things change over time. She approached her father and her grandfather, who were working in the tin shop, and she expressed her interest, and they said that it was inappropriate for a woman to be doing metal craft. And they suggested that she pick up pottery or weaving or something of that nature. And not to be deterred, she just hung out around the shop and she would pick up little scraps and try to make artwork out of that. But as far as any serious apprenticeship, they were at loggerheads. She couldn't get anywhere with it until the coming of World War II. And when World War II came, she was a classic Rosie the Riveter. She got in her car and went to Long Beach, California, got into the aircraft factories out there. And at the time when the ladies would go into the factories, you'd start down at the bottom of the rung in the production, which was Buckman, which was when you see that footage of people making the aircraft and they've got rivet guns. What you can't see is on the other side of that metal, there's someone holding on to a big chunk of metal, hanging on for dear life as the rivet is crushed between the rivet gun and what they call the bucking bar. There's really, really laborious work. And let's see here, I'm going to use a half round. This little guy. Next step, I'm going to use a half round from the front side. So we put in our edging here, and I'm going to do a little design right here. So she was always looking to move up and kind of move into these other positions, and they would do all kinds of tricks, she said, to be able to get through the shifts. Like when the padded shoulders were popular in the 80s, she said, "Oh, we figured that out a long time ago. The ladies, we would always pad our shoulders so that we could lay inside of the sharp aluminum angles of the aircraft during the long shifts and support our bodies to hold those bucking bars." And she was a fairly small-framed woman, so she would end up working on like the tail cone of these bombers. And I just can't even imagine what those shifts were like, to be literally on the inside of a cone of aluminum as somebody's hammering at it from the outside for it to shift. So what she would do is every time she'd get into a position, she would immediately start paying attention to what the girls did in the position above her. And then invariably, because it was the only way they could get any kind of a break, they would call in sick. And she would immediately raise up her hand and say, "I think I can fill in." And what she would do is fill in so well, they would give her a raise and let her rise up to the next level. And so she did that throughout the war, so that by the end of the war, she was what they called a lead shift supervisor doing remakes, which essentially means she was fixing other people's errors so that you didn't waste material. And she was working on those big pressurized bombers that they were making at the end of the war. Very, very intricate, difficult work. And so she came back from that experience, and she went to her dad and her great-grandfather and her grandfather, and she said, now that the U.S. government trusts me to make military bombers, do you think I can handle some small mirrors in the back shop? And that was it. That was it. They couldn't say no to it. So that's how she was able to get into the shop. So what I'm going to do now, you can see I've done this little edging here. I want to run a design along the outside edge of this mirror here. So what I'm going to do is take a dimension, and then this is where the dividers come in really handy. So I'm going to want that design to be about this distance from the edge. But with the dividers, what I can do is just roll that around the edge and get a line around even this complex shape that will be true to that distance around the perimeter of the design. Okay. Then I'm going to take a little bit of a larger half round and just follow those guidelines. I don't think I got that last one. There we go. Okay, and we end up there. So you can see we've run these little half round design around the perimeter of our mirror here. I'm going to work from the back side and just lightly tap this down to take that shaping out. And we're starting to get into an interesting area, and that is just like how much work is enough, right? So now I'm working from the back side of this piece on center of those little half rounds I put in with a nail set to push those out. And what happens is you can overwork a piece. You can definitely put too much stamp work into a piece, and different families and different tinsmiths will have a different feeling or an eye for what is the appropriate level of detail for a piece of tin work. For example, my great uncle Albert Delgado tended to like a very simple, clean look, whereas my grandmother tended to like a very ornate look. So, so they had some interesting discussions over the years that I was able to be a fly on the wall for, about the differences between ornate and gaudy. So I'm just using a small rosette here to fill in some of these negative spaces that were created by these designs that we laid in here. And then from the back side, I'm going to use a very small point and just push those out on center, just to give them a little bit of character, help them catch the light, so that we end up there. Okay? So there are certainly other things I could do to get more ornate, but I think we're going to go with Uncle Albert's suggestion this time and keep it just kind of nice and balanced at that level. And we're going to bring in, this is just a thin piece of cardboard, very similar to what you'd see as a backing on a legal pad. And it makes a great surface with which to solder onto. Now, at a later time, I'm going to go into a lot of detail about solder work, but for where we are today, I really just want you to be able to see how one of these pieces go together. So in order to solder, you want to clean your metal. I'm going to take my steel wool along the back here and just clean these surfaces, make them nice and fresh. I'm going to be using 50/50 solid core solder and a soldering gun, which is rated at, it's essentially like a 2-speed, a high and low, and it's rated at 260 and 200 watts. Anything over 100 watts is going to be enough for this kind of work. Obviously, I need something a little beefier just because the amount of solder work that I do. It gives me a better duty cycle, which basically means it can be on for a lot more of a given period of time. I've made some little tabs by just double folding a thin piece of tin here, and I'm going to angle these so that I can solder them in a way that they're going to kind of catch a little mirror in here to act as the mirror for our design. And I'm going to take the steel wool and also clean up the pads that I will be soldering to on these so that both sides are nice and clean. What we're trying to do is get a nice clean but rough surface so that the solder literally has something to grab to. I've pre-cut a mirror, and then I also have some mat board that I've made as a backing to protect that mirror from those metal tabs so that they don't scratch out the silvering on the back of the mirror. So I'm going to place this just like this. Now, without going into too much detail right now, what I will say is that it's very, very important to use proper cleaning to prep your metal. And you want to use a flux. In this case, it's a gel flux that I'm using called ruby fluid. So I'm going to apply that flux to it. The flux does a couple of things. One, it has an acid in it that will actually etch the material and help the solder flow. So I'm going to apply that down, bring my solder over. This is my spool of solder. And I'm going to hold it with this, my little chicken stick, and get my fingers away from the heat of that soldering gun. And now I'm just touching the solder. But here's what's important. To get a good soldering joint, this is not like hot glue, okay? You don't want to just put it down here and let it cool. You want to hold this in place, and what you're thinking of, the way you want to think of this is you need to raise the tin itself to the temperature required to melt the solder on its own, okay? It's not like hot glue where you can just drop hot solder down and let it cool and you're getting a nice solder joint. And a wax is a good comparison because if you think about it, if you were throwing a big old party in the 70s, you know, imagine that avocado heavy shag rug or a nice orange shag rug, and you got the glass coffee table in the center of the party and everybody's standing over it and somebody's lit up some candles and some wax from the candles falls on the table. Now, everybody has had that experience where sometimes you go to clean wax off glass and you literally can just flick off the little bits of it and it's no big deal. And then other times you feel like literally you need to take a knife or a blade and scrape every last piece of that wax off from that surface. And that's what it's like with solder. If you drop hot solder onto an unprepared surface, it has no real strength whatsoever to hold whatever bit you're trying to get on there in place. And I can give you an example of that. So here's an unprepped sheet of the turn plate that I cut from earlier, and I'm just going to melt a bit of solder and let it drop on here, and we'll see just how strong that is. Okay, so we'll let that cool. We got a little blotch right there. This is our little test. Let's see if the blotch makes a fool out of me here. So I'm getting a little bit of that solder over here. I'm bringing it over to the tab that I'm wanting to place, and I'm just holding this in place with the heat on. Again, letting that heat transfer from the tip of the soldering gun into the tin to raise it to the temperature required to melt the solder on its own. If you don't do that, you get what's called a cold solder joint. And the real tricky part about it is it looks okay. Because the solder melts, the solder looks just fine. But it doesn't have any real strength. So you send somebody home with a beautiful large mirror, they go hang it, and then a few days later, mysteriously, the mirror comes crashing off the wall. All right, so there's my tabs to hold the mirror in place. And I've cut a little circle here to act as a hanger. So that's what this final tab is that I'm putting on the mirror. Okay, and we'll finish it up by brushing it with a little bit of steel wool here. It's a nice clean finish. And there we go. We have a nice decorative mirror. So here's our back design, nice clean finish with the matte board, protective tabs, and a hanger right there. And then here's the design from the front. That's called a corazon, or a small tin mirror. Now let's take a look at it, see how our solder did. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. If you don't prep your solder correctly, there's no strength to your joint. So it's something you want to be careful with. Well, that's going to do it for today. I really appreciate you checking in. I hope you enjoyed and learned a little bit of something about this. Our intent is to not only work with tin, but also be working with copper, brass, other light gauge sheet metal, and use these tools and techniques to create a number of different projects, including utilitarian pieces like candle holders, candlesticks, and tissue box covers, all kinds of stuff like that. So I hope you'll return and enjoy it. Please consider subscribing, throw a like on the page, and if you want to be notified of when I do go live, you'll have to hit the bell as well when you subscribe. And if you'd like to share it with friends, I'd appreciate it. So thanks very much for checking in. This is Metalsmythe Shop, and thanks for checking in.